Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 10th of May, 2017, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. We're also joined today by live video Skype link by David Ellis from Strategic Defence Initiatives. Well, we've been told the sky is blue and the sun is shining in Norfolk. We'll leave it there because that's probably the only good news we're going to get today as we move into British and some world politics.
Well, let's start with this because the government released this news story today about the general election 2017, and it's all about protective security advice for the general election 2017. And they say as the general election approaches, it's important that individuals and organisations consider their protective security provisions. They remain vigilant and report suspicious behaviour and items to police at the earliest opportunity. The UK threat level remains at severe, meaning an attack is highly likely. Terrorist groups and individuals continue to encourage individuals to plan and mount attacks in the UK, particularly against symbols of the state and crowded places. Low sophistication, low complexity methodologies are the simplest to execute and require little or no training. And so it goes on, and they talk about protective security advice. They say personal security for those canvassing, that they should go to the Susie Lamplow Trust because that's the best place to go for advice for individuals and groups who are campaigning and canvassing. But they seem to be a little nervous, Brian.
Well, I think the fear factor is this is echo chamber stuff. So we have heavily conditioned and reframed members of parliament, and the advice they're getting is be fearful, terrorists are going to murder you in your beds. And so this just rotates and increases. It's interesting, I don't wake up frightened that I'm going to be murdered in my bed by some Islamic extremist. I'm much more concerned that I'm watching my country utterly destroyed by members of the respective three main parties.
Okay, well, let's move on to defence issues now. And Jens Stoltenberg, here he is. He was in number 10 this morning. This is him standing on his own outside number 10 this morning. So he must have arrived early because this press briefing took place at 10 o'clock and he'd already had his meeting with Theresa May. And this afternoon he's whizzing off to see Angela Merkel. So not quite sure exactly what's going on there. But he said, I just had a very good and productive meeting with Prime Minister May. We discussed many items, but the main topic was the preparation for the upcoming meeting of NATO leaders in Brussels on the 25th of May. And David, I'll just bring you in here because once again, we have a major NATO meeting, this time the meeting of NATO leaders. And where's it taking place? Brussels. So the EU, once again, is right at the centre of things.
It's completely in the centre, isn't it? No, NATO, that's all you need to know there, isn't it? NATO in Brussels, so in the defence discussions there. So this is pretty straightforward. We've got Parliament in recess, and Stoltenberg there as NATO chief is in with Theresa May discussing clearly what's the crisis with EU military union, EU military unification process. This is what the crisis is. Our old staff are beginning to wake up, the likes of David Richards, General Sir Mike Rose, and General Barons. They've got it. You know, I think these guys are now starting to see what's going on. And it won't take a great deal more for them to actually press the sweet spot and actually make some traction with this. So, you know, we're very close to seeing some productivity here, because what's going on clearly is this continuation of behind closed doors. For God's sake, we can't have the general public knowing what's really going on in the EU, what is the most important thing, and what the general public in Britain are being kept out of. And this information, this vital information, is being withheld from them.
Yep. If I just come in here, I just find it extraordinary that this man is allowed to stand outside number 10 briefing. How is the British public to know that what this man says is genuine? Normally, if there's been meetings in number 10, you'll see the Prime Minister or another cabinet minister at least standing alongside the guest, in inverted commas. And therefore, you know that what's being said is being said with the full approval of that member of the British government. So we've got a unique occasion here. We don't have a government at the moment. Along comes Mr. Stoltenberg and is talking to the British public as if we are to believe everything that comes out of his mouth, which I don't.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, what this is Mr. Stoltenberg speaking on behalf of Her Majesty's government making a defence statement? Is that what's happened?
No, it was a NATO briefing.
Oh, sorry, it was a NATO briefing, so it wasn't anything to do with us then.
No. No. Okay. Well, let's look at what else he had to say. He said, well, it's interesting that the BBC was criticising the British public recently for not being able to count with regard to the SATs test for primary school children. But here we go. He said, and there are two main topics to be addressed at that meeting. This is the meeting in Brussels: burden sharing, transatlantic unity, and the fight against terrorism.
I'm sure that's three. I'm not entirely sure, Mike, but I think that's three.
I think that is, yes. But then the main issue was our biggest military operation ever is our operation in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan is about fighting terrorism. And this was really the main thread that was covered by mainstream press today, about the fact that he was intending to ask Theresa May for more assistance on the Afghanistan issue. And he was asked how many more troops would he be looking for from the UK, and what kind of response did he get from Mrs. May to the request. And he said that the request from our military authorities is about a few thousand, but this is something which is then going to be delivered from all allies and from many partner nations. So it's not just a few NATO allies that will deliver those forces, it's the whole alliance. So in other words, he wasn't particularly keen to specify exactly how many he was expecting from the UK. But I guess since we don't have very many left, we don't have very many to give.
No, well, we're talking about a few divisions is all we've got left. We're talking about the British Army being about 80,000 men, so we're in a serious position here. But of course, what is going on in Afghanistan, Mike? We're hearing reports that it's beginning to fragment, that we're getting more terrorist input. Supposedly, it's degenerating into another Iraq.
Well,
so we've got to put more troops back in.
That's right. We're moving our tame ISIS terrorists into Afghanistan to work alongside the Taliban at the moment, of course. Okay. Well, David, look, the Sun was really an exclusive for them, as far as I know. The headline is: Alarmed Forces, Army Chiefs and Wounded War Heroes deliver a damning letter to PM demanding she save forces from cuts. And this is from David Willits. And they're saying that a £10 billion black hole has led to fears of more cuts on top of those already suffered since 2010. There were 25 signatories to the letter. It includes 4 service chiefs, top academics, and they say that the 2015 review was a blueprint for the future, but it's being underfunded. The letter blasts, according to The Sun, official spin to cover up the scandal. But correct me if I'm wrong, but this article and everything in it is spin, because it's there to, again, divert attention away from the European Union.
Yeah, this is very convenient window and chatter, political and public political sort of radar jamming stuff here. It's taking the wind out of the actual argument. So it's very good. It's very useful that that the old guard there are doing what they're doing and saying what they're saying. But this is only the first step in actually getting the lid off this. So we're no further ahead, really. The situation is exactly the same now as it was under David Cameron when when Number 10 and the Tories fabricated a letter appending senior officers' names to it without their authority, which was where we came in, really. We broke that story, and we broke that story at the start of Brexit and tried to sort of get it going. So the Tory party were desperate to get the officers' support for EU, because it would then link instantaneously for them supporting EU military union, whether they knew it or not. So that was how it would be used politically. So that situation has not changed. The Conservative Party are desperate to carry on with this, and they'll pretty much do anything in order to get that. So this is okay as a start from General Richards there, but what has to happen is it has to be cited for what's actually going on. And the reason British defence is like it is, the British military is like it is, and British industry is like it is as a result of adoption of supranational treaty from Lisbon and St Malo, and thereby EU military unification process, where the national militaries are being unified via policy and budgets. So this is the money issue now with everybody, why we're getting cuts. They're not cuts, It is blending the policy and the budget into single point control from Brussels, where they can then set their budget for defence and defence services in the EU zone. So that currently includes us. So there is no Brexit because our military will be in the EU. The military will not be Brexiting as it stands. They will be in because that debate isn't happening. It's not being mentioned. The politicians will do anything they can in order to avoid this because they know it's a Pandora's box. The British people love their military and they will not see them going into union with Germany. Now, ironically, we've just seen a great sort of chiaroscuro here, a great contrast with how Mr. Putin and the Russian nation have honoured their war dead and marched for their war dead to defeat fascism and the Nazis in World War II, and what they did there in Red Square. What did we have? May didn't do that, did she? She didn't march with the veterans, no, because she's too busy locking them up. So this is the reality here is the Conservatives have a Pandora's box. They cannot, will not debate EU military union process, and the ultimate goal of getting full our military into union with the rest of the EU zone, because they know damn well the British people won't support it at the ballot box. If it's aired now in this general election, she will lose the general election. It's as simple as that. So this is what everybody's got to do. We've got to see the wood from the trees here, you know. I mean, this is okay what Willetts has done here, but it's not actually debating the real sweet spot, the Achilles heel. It's not getting to the nitty gritty.
Okay, well, a related article then on the BBC, and this one from Jonathan Beale, and it's almost like, he hasn't called it a fact-checking article, but that's what it's almost like. 5 questions on defence spending that won't go away, he said. A distinguished group of former military top brass has written an open letter to the Prime Minister warning that Britain's security is at risk unless the armed forces are properly funded. The letter reflects concern right across the ranks. The list includes not just the old and the bold, but former colonels, and so it goes on. And he lists the 5 questions. The first one is, how do we deal with a more dangerous world? And in brackets, and Brexit. He said there's always the danger of crying wolf, but few would disagree that the world is dangerous. The letter cites risks from all over the globe. And he says that almost $30 billion worth of foreign military purchases planned by the Ministry of Defence are exposed to currency fluctuations, so that's a risk. And then he says, does the UK meet the 2% NATO target? He says they do, but that people are saying that this is creative accounting. In fact, in the letter, that's the term that they used. But he says that the calculations that are used to reach this 2% figure are entirely in accordance with NATO's own rules. And then he asks, is defence spending rising? And then he asks, is smaller more capable? And he's saying things like Britain's armed forces are now at their smallest since Napoleonic Wars. The size of the army alone has been cut from more than 100,000 to just 82,000. Even then, the army is struggling with recruitment and still below fully trained strength. He said, but there are still significant gaps. For example, Royal Navy warships are no longer fitted with anti-ship missiles. The Navy can't afford them, so it's all about not being able to afford stuff. And he uses the term hollowed out, which I thought was quite interesting. And he said, then he went on to ask, is there a black hole in the defence budget? He said a couple of things about that. But it's still not clear, he said, whether those concerns are shared by the voters and whether defence features much in the general election. So I think the reason that it's not featuring much in the general election, David, you've just expressed. But we tweeted something out earlier on this article and pointed Mr. Beale at the UK column's page on EU military unification. And then you followed up by retweeting and so on. But Mr. Beale apparently didn't like what you posted too much, David, because this was his response. You're a loon and a pest, happy to block.
It's awfully interesting stuff, isn't it? Because all I did was give him the short and sweet on EU military unification process and what that was about and why that Brussels has to set a single point budget. Now, that's awfully interesting because I'd like to see him call Lord Tebbit a loon and a pest and block him, because that was something that both he and I were in agreement on. And I think Tebbit has written to that effect. Now, if he wants to go further with this, obviously within his critique of what the situation is within these 5 points, none of which he actually mentions what's really going on as to the reason for this is the policy blending and the budgetary blending. We're talking about a shortfall of money, yes, but that's because the policy is to cut and blend into unifying our national military into EU military. That's what's happening. But he isn't debating that, of course, because he can't, I suppose, or doesn't know about it or doesn't want to. So I've gave a reasoned, a few points there back on Twitter as a reasoned argument as to what we perceive as going on, based on the source and causation that we've got from Avril Harriman. So him as chief envoy to the Marshall Plan for the rebuilding of Europe cited the componentry to the full unification of Europe immediately after the war. So this is all open. This is not a secret, for God's sake, that it would be currency union, military union. There would then be a treasury, and then there would be full political union. So if Mr. Beale there has got problems with this, then I think he needs to get on to the Bank of International Settlements and take it up with them, where that money is administered and managed from. So I'm in complete disagreement with him. I think his behaviour is very unreasonable, and it just smacks of sort of being childish, really, to block someone on there when you're having an adult, what I perceive was an adult conversation on serious defence matters. But I've got to say that there is an advocate and a solution for this within the Conservative Party, and ironically, he's an ex-NM Rothschild banker, and that was John Redwood. I've seen John Redwood within the 1922 Conservative Backbench Committee cite that this money needed to be redirected from the EU investment bank that funds the EU Defence Agency, where Mrs. May is the biggest contributor in Europe. So in effect, Mrs. May is contributing to EU military union or EU army, aka, at the expense of Her Majesty's Armed Services. So we're seeing cuts on the one hand, but huge amounts of money being invested into this arrangement. Now, John Redwood there spoke out and said this was wrong, that money should be stopped. We should redirect it within the UK in order that our internal economy and our industry would benefit from it, and we could actually then reinvest in our military, and we might then be able to undertake something along the lines of what capability we had under the Falklands. Now, obviously, I mean, Jonathan Beale there is sort of talking about sort of everything other than what the reality is, because he's saying there, I mean, this is the interesting bit, he's saying about 30 billion will be spent in foreign purchases. That does this country no good whatsoever. Full stop.
Yeah.
Well, you've hit the nail on the head there, but it's remarkable that the BBC becomes so aggressive so quickly when they're challenged about what they're putting out. And I think this actually is a little bit of an education for us, because it's saying if you're unhappy with what the BBC is doing, which most people are, or a lot of people are, don't talk about the BBC. Go for the individual journalists. Go for the people that are producing this material for them. And clearly this man is not prepared to do any investigative journalism. He's not prepared to at least have a discussion with you about what you're talking about. You're a pest, you're blocked. I'm the BBC, you should believe what I say. Well, let's get on to what the Mirror says. This was quite an interesting little article. I think this is more of the Russian fear hype. But we've got a Russian Kilo class, a diesel-electric submarine, which apparently HMS Somerset found it detected. I don't think so. I think the submarine was on the surface and probably quite easy to see. But there we are, sailing close to UK territorial waters last month. So we've got a bit more of the hyping of Russia is up to no good, but this is all normal stuff which navies do. This interested me. The commanding officer of HMS Somerset said policing the sea was core business for the Navy. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad he understands what he's supposed to be doing. I'm not sure how that's educated the public, but there we are. That's core business. And I thought we'd just point this out, that of course the Russians still operating quiet diesel-electric submarines. We got rid of our last diesel-electric submarines back in 1994. This was more cuts, but this was a major policy change, that we would to get rid of the very quiet, very effective diesel-electric submarines and simply go nuclear. Many people said this was a disastrous decision. The Russians certainly haven't followed that line. They've kept their diesel electric submarines, but ours were simply sold off on the cheap to Canada. And this caused a lot of consternation inside the Royal Navy. This was an early example of government cuts dictating defence policy instead of saying, what do we need to defend the country, and then how do we afford that? And I'm just emphasising here, we're left with an all-nuclear submarine fleet. Of course, many of those boats we know have got engineering problems at the moment, but something to remember, of course, is the nuclear submarines simply not good at operating in coastal and shallow water.
No, especially when they run into sandbanks.
Well, that was one of the nuclear ones, actually, but yeah. Shallow water, difficult. Now, let's come through to this story, which is tragic because a Royal Navy commander committed suicide. This is back in January, but the information just starting to come out, and the Mirror has got quite a lot on this particular story. Now, we were intrigued and we followed it through, and it's led us to some extremely interesting information, which I think, David Ellis, you will be interested when you see where this takes us. So what was actually going on here is that basically this commander committed suicide. His father, a doctor, questioned the police and the coroner's court as to the delays in taking blood samples and to identify the cause of death. The coroner absolutely adamant that it was suicide because he was found on his own. Doors were locked, but there was no suicide note. But it was suicide according to the coroner. But his wife was clearly unhappy with what was going on because she started to make her own inquiries. She spoke with friends and other Royal Navy members he'd known for a long time, and she was interested to know if there were any changes in her husband's behaviour. Now, he had according to several articles, some mental health problems, but I was interested that this lady was clearly very keen to know whether there'd been changes in this man. As a result of her asking inquiries, she got two, she says, naval officers knocking on her door. I think these would have been suits. And they started to ask her why she'd mentioned her husband and the word Trident. And this is because he'd been working on the Trident submarine project. But in the article, we picked up this. In a statement after his death, the MOD said he was involved in a wide range of complex projects, which required him to understand not only the complex world of acquisition, but also how the Royal Navy's global capability is generated at Abbey Wood. Now, Abbey Wood is the MOD establishment up near Bath. What do you think they're talking about with the complex world of acquisition, Mike? I was intrigued by this phrase.
It's unclear, isn't it?
It's unclear. So we've got language which is not clear to the ordinary person, but the MOD thinks that this is of significance. And I find it surprising that a Royal Navy commander wouldn't know how the Royal Navy's global capability is generated. So two curious things mentioned there by the MOD. Well, let's come into this. And we know that Royal Navy personnel are increasingly given leadership training, which includes the undeclared use of NLP. And we've consistently said that NLP has dangers, particularly for those people who have mental health issues, whether those are diagnosed or not. And the second thing is we have been warning for years that the political charity Common Purpose has been active in the military, also using NLP in all three services. And we have had some very interesting reports from young Royal Marines and Army personnel over the years who've reported personality changes in colleagues after those colleagues were ordered to take so-called prophylactic PTSD drugs. Now, what I mean by that is that they were told that you don't have PTSD, but we think you need to take the medication to prevent the onset. This is a very, very interesting way to use medication. But some of these men actually told us that they were told to commit suicide by psychiatrists to whom they were referred through the military system. So there's some very, very dark things which are unfolding inside the military. And what we are beginning to gain an impression of is that things are being done to military personnel which are having an adverse effect. Now, stay with me, just follow through this, and we'll come back over to David Ellis. But we went looking for this acquisition strategy. What is this? What is it about? We came upon this man, Tony Graham, who appears to be a retired admiral constructor. In this particular text, we found this. I also graduated from numerous leadership programs, such as the Acquisition Leaders Development Scheme, Public Sector Leaders Scheme, Common Purpose, and the Windsor Leadership Trust. So this appears to be a classic example that we have senior military people who can only do their job or perhaps can't do their job as a result of being trained as leaders. And the Windsor Leadership Trust, one of the top ones, Mike, with
Prince Philip.
Participation by Prince Philip. David, I've got a little bit more on this, but who are these people training our military? What safety checks have been done on the techniques being used? And how is it that we've now got defence people freely mixing and discussing defence topics with unknown trainers?
Well, actually, because this was a key point about the Acquisition Leaders Development Scheme, this was a joint training program between military personnel and civilian personnel.
Yeah.
So you were mixing both, David?
This is very, very disturbing, very, very alarming. It's very, very unusual for a Royal Navy officer to commit suicide. The instances are so small, so it begs the question, what on earth has gone on here? Very alarming, very disturbing, very sad. Yep. Very sad indeed. My initial thoughts are on this. I mean, I don't know about this case, but I'll certainly be taking it up with our network of ex-admirals. I've got to say, and this is something that you've seen and said for quite some time now, Brian, is what on earth is happening with external companies, external NGOs, external training groups, organisations that all clearly have their own agenda. They have a separate agenda to that of the state or the Royal Navy. They have funding separate to that of Her Majesty's government. They have funding from elsewhere. They have an agenda from elsewhere. What are they doing being allowed to be within our nuclear deterrent and our critical Royal Navy? They shouldn't be allowed anywhere near it. Who on earth has made the decision to let these people and these groups come into the Royal Navy? The Royal Navy should be conducting its own training and its own affairs with these matters in-house, where it can be managed securely.
Right, David, once again...
It's as simple as that. It's wrong.
David, once again, and with no discussion before the news, you're on live and you'll seen this information for the first time. You've hit the nail on the head again. So let's go down that line. This is what that particular gentleman was involved with. It's called UK NEST, UK Naval Engineering Science and Technology. It's running campaigns to recruit people throughout the military and through civilian companies and civilian training organisations and civilian education organisations. And what are they talking about? Acquiring the right people. Now, what sort of people are being acquired? Well, when I read this bit, I was just stunned because they talk about a lady called Natalie Desty, who's working alongside Captain Matt Bolton, Royal Navy. This young lady is an engineer, all credit to her. She's become an engineer, but she's only 31 years old. But according to the data that I've been reading, she was involved with the Queen Elizabeth class carriers. She's running a team of 30 experts on a £7 million budget, and she is now helping to train the Royal Navy to recruit the right people. She doesn't have a degree in any form of maritime background degree. She's got her engineering degree, it seems, but she's only 31, and now she's working alongside these other individuals as if she is a major component of the defence procurement industry. So what's going on here? Well, I went looking again, and this led me to the American military, where they were actually talking about this acquisition leadership. And look at what it says here. The program is targeted to assist new hires into the workforce. It builds a solid foundation for effective and efficient acclimation into the workforce by introducing participants to their behavioral preferences and leadership tendencies, giving them the big picture. And then it goes on to say here that you can see it at the bottom, I'll just highlight it. Ultimately, the program goal is to mitigate the frustrations and misunderstanding commonly experienced by new hired people. So they're going to give a solid foundation, common language, common expectations. They're talking about following. This is about a society where you can only join this cult if you follow the particular norms. David, I don't know whether you want to respond to this.
Yeah, I mean, just as a snapshot here, my gut reaction to all this is that we have a complete failure of security with our military, an absolute failure. And everybody in the world knows exactly what we're doing, where we're going, what we've got. There is no security. If this is as endemic as what you're suggesting here, there is a huge problem. Yep. Because if you know where key officers are and what they're doing, you would be able to calculate exactly what you've got, where you've got, who's on, who's off, what's in, what's out, and what our current status is. So this is one big huge security breach.
This is one huge security breach, and where can we now start to come back? Well, we'll end on this note for this section of the news. This comes straight back to the Cabinet Office Major Projects Leadership Academy. This is done in partnership with the Oxford Said Business School. And if people don't know who Mr. Said is, well, he was a former arms dealer involved in vast arms contracts. Barclays Bank decided that they didn't want him as a customer anymore because they didn't know whether he met their money laundering safeguards. But this is the man behind the business school that's now teamed up with the Cabinet Office to train people, including the military. I think we know where the security breach is.
Right. AV8.
AV8, there are still day tickets available for Ian Crane's AV8, the weekend of the 21st of May. So if you're thinking of coming, you can still come on a day ticket. It means you have to sort out your own accommodation because the hotel is now booked for accommodation, which is really excellent. This will be a tremendous event. I'm pleased to say I will be speaking alongside others, but still time to get your tickets through Ian Crane's website.
Right. Now, yesterday we highlighted this report from Lebanese satellite television suggesting that the US, the UK were gathering heavy armaments on the border of Jordan and Syria. The reports also suggested that at least 4,000 militants were assembled along the Jordanian border as well. So that was yesterday. And you mentioned yesterday, Brian, that I had had a call from the Ministry of Defence. Well, when we came on air yesterday, replying to my questions, the gent from the Ministry of Defence hadn't anything particular to say to me. But he phoned me late yesterday afternoon. He said that if we look in this image that there are no British tanks there, so we don't need to worry about that. He said it was quite likely that the US tanks and armour that were there, that Jordan had bought from the United States in the past, and that probably they'd moved them to this area just to be a little bit mischievous or something like that, is what he basically said. But then the most telling part of it as well, of what he said, was that of course, there are no British boots on the ground in Syria. Well, I didn't ask him about British boots on the ground in Syria. I asked him about British boots on the ground in Jordan, waiting possibly to go into Syria. Well, although he denied that there was any such plan, I just found it interesting that he wanted to kind of divert my attention back towards Syria again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is increasingly the response from the Ministry of Defence. You either get no response or you get a sort of smokescreen response.
Well, at least he replied. So it must merely be a coincidence then that the Syrian Air Force is now targeting terrorist centers at the border with Jordan. This just must be coincidence, Brian. This is, of course, Iranian press, Fars, saying that opposition groups' media sources confirmed that the Syrian Air Force has bombed terrorist concentration centers heavily along the border with Jordan in retaliation for militant attacks on pro-government forces in the region. Just a coincidence. Also, the Russians then in Syria have taken up an offensive against ISIL, ISIS, Daesh, whatever you want to call it, in East Aleppo. But I suppose this is the main story with regard to Syria. And, well, it's about Indonesia. Because Vanessa Beeley and I were talking this morning, and she had discovered White Helmets Indonesia. And she asked what I thought. And I said, well, look, first glance, this website is running on Blogger, so it's not, doesn't have the same polish and money, financial backing that the White Helmets website has. So perhaps it's simply some people in Indonesia that think that what the White Helmets is doing is great, and they're trying to replicate it in some way. There's a couple of stories on this. Go and have a look at it. They're presenting themselves as being humanitarians in Indonesia, and so on. So that's the White Helmets in Indonesia. The person who's registered the domain name seems to be an IT guy. This is his name, Radio Abalian, sorry. But some strange things here. Go and, if you can track this this page that's on screen down at the moment, go and have a look at the slideshow that he has on there. I'm at the moment trying to find out what it's about, because it's all in Arabic and Indonesian, a mixture of both. But what's interesting is that he seems to be removing himself from social media at the moment. So his Facebook page is offline. His Twitter page, he has made that protected Twitter account, so only people that are following him, that he's given permission to see his tweets, can see his tweets. So, as I say, thought it perhaps to me it looked like a copycat website, maybe wasn't linked to the White Helmets in any way. But then Vanessa discovered that, in fact, it was being backed by a foundation called, well, here is the Golden Future Foundation. And I've got to thank Alex Thompson for giving me a translation of this, because what we have here is a partnership agreement which links us straight back to Syria. This is a partnership agreement between the undersigned, the chief executive of the Golden Future Foundation, which is an Indonesian NGO, and project manager of A Million Letters for Syria, which is apparently so we've got a Syrian link here, and they're trying to raise money for Syria. The letter here saying that that the Golden Future Foundation is entitled to manage humanitarian funds channeled by the Million Letters for Syria campaign, and that they're going to draw up a program of humanitarian work tailored as enabled by amounts of donations channeled by the Million Letters for Syria campaign, and so on. So it goes on. Now here's a little bit more on the Golden Future Foundation. They are apparently giving talks in primary schools in Malaysia. So this is clearly pan-national, so it goes beyond borders anyway. Now, why is this interesting? Well, if we look at, aside from the fact that the White Helmets is being brought into Indonesia, we thought it was interesting in the context of the sort of political situation in Indonesia at the moment, because the place is being systematically destabilized, it seems. And here we have a report from The Guardian. In fact, it's their view on the blasphemy in Indonesia, exploiting the region for political purposes, is what the headline says. They're saying that the jailing of Jakarta's Christian governor for 2 years for blasphemy is a shocking and harsh ruling in a case that should never have been brought. It goes further than even prosecutors had sought. They asked for a suspended 1-year sentence, on a lesser charge. He had cited a verse from the Quran, which he said was misused to deceive voters into believing non-Muslims should not lead Muslims. So clearly sectarian tensions being driven in in Indonesia at the moment. So, the question on our mind then is, why would there be a need for the white helmets in Indonesia? Is there something coming down the pipe that we don't know about? And I'm wondering how long it takes to recruit and train a so-called civil defense organization, because perhaps that gives us an indication as to time scales involved. But of course, if you look at a map of Southeast Asia, what we have here then is Indonesia being destabilized. Of course, the Philippines have gone rogue, so perhaps destabilization will head over towards the Philippines. Burma is another possibility. We've certainly got tensions with Korea at the moment. And of course, all this potentially gives an excuse for China to be encircled, just as Russia has been. And so we find it pretty concerning that the white helmets that are being migrated from Syria into Indonesia. And Vanessa has always held the view that the white helmets would be shipped out to other potential trouble spots around the world, so because they can generate such PR for the agenda. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think there's something very, very interesting here. I think it's been proven overwhelmingly now that, of course, the white helmets in Syria are absolutely not what the mainstream media are claiming they are, which is a help organisation. These are people running a geopolitical agenda and doing it in a pretty vicious and crude manner. This smells of Mr. Soros and change agents operating on an international scale to me.
Yeah. Right. Just before we move on from Syria then, this is Dr. Saleha Hassan, who is known from the Saving Syria's Children documentary, the Panorama documentary, and of course subsequently she ended up being a television personality. Now Robert Stewart has pushed this out today, very keen for anybody that would like to get along to this event in Dundee University on the 13th of May, which is Saturday. So Dr. Saleha Hassan, Dundee medical graduate, they say, whose career has taken her to our TV and film screens, will return to Dundee University to give the last of this year's Saturday evening lectures. They give a description of her and so on. But the point is that, of course, she was instrumental in the Saving Syria's Children documentary, which we are describing as a piece of fake news. And so there is an opportunity to ask questions. If anybody would like to get along to that, get onto the University of Dundee website, have a look at the event page, and all the details are there. It's apparently a first come, first served thing. So the tickets are free. They're available by visiting the Dundee University website or emailing events@dundee.ac.uk. And you can get a free ticket, but the seats are first come, first served. So I encourage anybody that can to get along and ask some questions. And with a view to generating those questions, we're going to show our episode of Insight just immediately after this programme, which covers the Saving Syria's Children documentary.
And perhaps we can just add to that, more and more people say to us, what can we do? And we say, get out there and challenge the actual people involved in the news or the propaganda, whatever it is. So this is a classic example of attending a meeting, asking polite but penetrating, accurate questions can produce the most amazing results. We need to get more people doing this. Right, well, let's jump to FBI Director Comey, who's been sacked by Trump. And we were intrigued by this Times article by a gentleman called Reese Blakely, who's the Times Washington correspondent. There are no facts in this article at all. It is just a statement that naughty Mr. Trump has sacked James Comey. It's outrageous. There is no proper investigative journalism about what James Comey had been involved in. And of course, the key thing was his involvement in protecting Hillary Clinton when she was doing what she was doing. Now, if you'd say, well, this is just UK columns saying this, what we're going to say to you is there are literally hours and hours of video footage of this Senator Trey Gowdy questioning FBI Director James Comey over his actions in relation to Hillary Clinton. What comes out in the interviews, and indeed where Trey Gowdy is interviewing Hillary Clinton herself, is of course that she lied and lied again about thousands of emails, major security breaches which would have put American military personnel in prison, and she had completely betrayed the US officials in Benghazi who were murdered as a result of what many would say was Hillary Clinton's security breaches and utter betrayal. But the Times of London apparently has not seen any of these interviews. It would appear that their journalist has not bothered to attend as a journalist any of those Senate committees investigating Comey. There's simply a bland article with no real facts or substance pushing out the anti-Trump, anti-Russian line with no substance. So once again, we say focus on the journalist. This is his Twitter page. If you go on it, you will see more of the same. He simply pushes forward what has been said in other media outlets. There's no proper analysis. It's just recircled. And we've just been talking about Syria. This is part of his tweets here. US officials said there were Russians in parts of the base. This is the base for the Tomahawk strike, but extraordinary precautions were taken to avoid striking them. Their presence at a base linked to chemical weapons raises questions about how much the Kremlin knew of Assad's plan. So this is the usual thing, and this is what he actually tweeted out with this quote. The top quote's from an American official, obviously. The bottom bit is what he tweeted: precautions to avoid killing Russians, but their presence raises question of whether Putin was complicit in the chemical attack. So again, no evidence whatsoever from this journalist. And this is another one. The United States is working to remove President Assad of Syria from power, and after a chemical attack that killed scores of civilians. No evidence, no investigation, simply words on a page, supposedly by a reputable Times of London. This has got to an incredible stage, Mike, where journalists, for not the red tops, but for papers which claim that they're the leaders in worldwide reporting, simply do no investigative journalism at all. David, on that note, with an eye on the clock, we're getting towards the end of the programme. Any comments?
It looks very much there as it looks here. It looks like we've got some kind of a free-for-all, doesn't it? We've got a free-for-all in Downing Street and a free-for-all over there in Washington, by the look of it. It's just absolutely breathtaking that, you know, is this where we are now in the Western world? Is this what's acceptable?
Yeah.
Is this what the people are going to put up with and tolerate
Well,
as their representatives? It is just beyond any reason.
It's beyond reason. The solution, of course, is to wake the rest of the population up that can't see what's happening. We are saying that UK is simply being hollowed out now. We're being attacked by our own government. Behavioural change, leadership is actually one of the key tools. David, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to stay over the forthcoming days and weeks on this subject to defence, because with Britain's proper defence gone, we no longer exist as a nation state, and this is clearly where Theresa May wants to go. We need to expose it. Thank you very much to all the people who've donated to the UK column. If you're not a subscriber, please sign up. We can only do what we do with your help. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Right.